Masechta Maasros, Parak Aleph, Mishnah Aleph. Klal Amr b'Maasros, there's a big rule regarding Maasros. The term Maaser again refers to the tenth of the crop that a person must separate to give to the Levi, to take it to Yerushalayim and give to the poor. These tenths are known as Maaser Rishon, Maaser Sheni, and Maaser Ani respectively, and they were all explained in the Akdama to the Masechta. However, the term Maasros in plural is sometimes used to refer to all the portions that must be separated from a crop, including Truma, which is a portion that's given to the Kohen, which is only 2% of the crop. This is the sense in which the term Maaseros is going to be used throughout this Masechta. A person does not have to separate these Maaseros for every kind of produce. Some kinds of produce are always exempt, and even produce that usually is subject to Maaseros is exempt in certain situations. The Mishnah is going to teach us the halacha about this. So, Klal Amr b'Maaseros, there's a rule regarding Maaseros. Kol shu oichel, anything that's food that's normally eaten by people, v'nishmar, and it's protected, that it has an owner who guards it, as opposed to hefker, which is not mechuyev ha'maiser, v'gidulav min ha'aretz, and it grows on the ground, which excludes mushrooms and truffles, which grow on the ground without having any roots in the ground. They draw their nourishment from the air, not from the ground. Chayiv b'maises is subject to the halachas of maises. Produce that does not have any of these three qualifications is not mechuyev ha'maiser. All these halachas are learned up from a pasuk, aser ta'aser kol tuva zarecha. You should separate maizer from all the produce of your planting. The word tuas, produce, usually means grain. However, the Torah uses it here to refer to produce in general. This teaches that we must separate maizer only from produce that is like grain, and that it's a species eaten by people. The phrase you're planting, as kol tuas zarecha, teaches that maizer obligate, the chiyuv of maizer applies to produce that is yours, zaracha, that's yours, which belongs to you, and it's not ownerless. And the word zarecha also teaches that it applies only to produce that's planted on the ground. Word klal acher amru, and another rule they said about Maaseros, kol shatchilase oichel v'seifa oichel, anything that's food at the beginning of its growth and food at the end of its growth, that is, anything can be eaten as soon as it starts growing. Aval pishu shemrei lahaitzav oichel, even though a person usually doesn't eat it when it's small, but keeps it in the ground to let it grow bigger and add more food. Chayiv katan v'gadol is subject to the chiyuv of Maaser whether he picks it when it's small or large. However, anything that's not a food at the beginning of its growth, but it's a food at the end of its growth when it reaches its full size, is not subject to the chiyuv of Maaser until it ripens and becomes food. Mishnah Beis. In the previous Mishnah, we learned that if produce is not edible when it first starts to grow, it's not mechuyev and meiser until it grows to a point where it becomes edible. The Mishnah begins listing different kinds of fruits and teaches at what stage they become edible, and thus, when are they going to be mechuyev and meisers. So, from when does produce become mechuyev in the halachas of meisers? Figs become subject once they begin to ripen when the tips of the figs turn white. Avashim are a low quality grape, become subject once the seeds can be seen through the skin. I wonder if avashim and hiv ishu have anything to do with each other, because they're all the same letters. The pasuk in Yeshaya, the Rav brings up the pasuk vayas be'ushim. This week's parasha, Parashas Va'era, it says vayivash haya'or from the tzardeya, from the dam and the tzardeya. Means to not have a nice smell. It's to be rotten, to be moldy. Cornelian cherries and mulberries become subject once they turn red. What are these cherries? The Rambam explains this word to refer to sumac elsewhere. Similarly, all red fruits become subject to hilchas maasros once they turn red. Pomegranates become subject to maasros once they become soft enough that one can crush the seeds with his finger. Even if one seed is this soft, the whole pomegranate is already mechuyev maaser, because it's a sign that all the seeds are now edible. Dates become chayev in maaser once they develop cracks like sourdough. That is when they start to have ridges in their skin similar to the cracks that develop on the surface of sourdough. Sourdough is a dough that has become very leavened. As the leavening increases, the smooth surface of the dough begins to develop cracks. Peaches are mechuyev and maaser once they develop red streaks in their skins. Gidim are like sinews, but it's not really sinews, but it just means red streaks that look like that. Walnuts become subject once they form a storehouse. That is, once the kernel of the nut separates from the outer shell and sits inside as if it was in a storehouse. When a walnut starts growing, the kernel of the nut is attached to the outer shell. As it begins to ripen, the kernel separates from the shell and sits inside of it as if it's simply being stored there. Rabbi Yehuda says the walnuts and almonds become subject once they form the thin shell that surrounds the kernel itself, which does not happen until the nuts are completely ripe. In walnuts and almonds, the dark brown skin grows inside the nut around the lighter colored kernel. These are usually peeled off before the nuts are eaten. The Chacham, however, hold that almonds, like walnuts, become subject once the kernel separates from the outer shell. Mishnah Gimel. Hecharuva misheina kedu, carob, bucks become mechuyev b'maisa once they develop black spots. When it starts to ripen, it develops black spots. By the time it's fully ripe, it's completely black. Similarly, all dark fruits become obligated once they develop black spots. Pears, agosam are pears. Krustumlin is a small type of apple that resembles a gallnut. In Klayim, Perik Aleph, the Rav says that it's a small kind of pear. Perhaps the Rav here is referring to one of the varieties of pears that are apple-shaped. Quinces and sorb apples all become mechuyev in Hilchas Maisos once they develop bald spots. It is once the fuzzy surface that covers them, when they are small, starts to fall off, leaving some empty spots where there's no fuzzy covering. This is a sign that they're starting to ripen. When they're fully ripe, the fuzzy covering falls off completely. Our pears today do not grow with this covering. The Mishnah is discussing certain varieties of pears that do have such a covering. Maybe in Eretz Yisrael or Bavel or wherever it was, they had such a kind of pear, but we don't know. Bisman we don't have it definitely in America, in New York or in the tri-state area. I don't know, unless it means like the brown pears that have like a mushroom, fuzzier kind of peel than the regular smooth things. I don't know. Similarly, all white fruits, any fruit that's not red or black, becomes mechuyev meiser once they have bald spots. Hastilton mishet tzamach mishet titzameach. Fenugreek is obligated once it would sprout, once it has grown enough that if seeds were planted, new plants of the silton would grow. Grain and olives are mechuyev meiser once they grow to a third of their full size. Mishnah Dalet. Ubayarek, among the vegetables. We learned in Mishnah Aleph that those kinds of produce that can be eaten as soon as they start growing are mechuyev meiser, even if they are picked when they're very small. Now the Mishnah is going to give a list of these things. V'hayarek, and amongst the vegetables, hakishuim, v'adluim, v'avtichim, v'amalafafinais, cucumbers, gourds, melons, and Kirby cucumbers, which are smaller cucumbers, hatapuchin, v'esregim, and amongst the fruits, apples and esregim, chayavim, k'telim, uktanim. These are subject to meiser whether they are picked when they're big or small, because they're edible as soon as they start growing. Reb Shimon paiters esregim b'katnan. However, Reb Shimon exempts esregim from meiser when they're still small. Reb Shimon holds that esregim that have just started growing are not edible enough to be subject to meiser. Now it's very interesting because the esregim that we have bisman hazeh, they're very difficult to eat because there's a very, very thick peel around the fruit. The amount of fruit that you have in an esrog is very, very minimal. But I guess in those days, it was much more of an edible fruit. I mean, if we go with Taisis and Brachas, I believe it's Daf Mem Beis or Mem Gimel or somewhere over there that talks about a tapuach being an esrog being a tapuach. So that would make things a little more complicated altogether. Hachayev b'shkedim hamarim poter b'masukim. The Mishnah now teaches about a certain kind of produce that can only be eaten before it reaches its full size. There are two types of almonds, bitter ones and sweet ones. Bitter almonds cannot be eaten when they are ripe because they're too bitter. They can only be eaten when they're still small and not yet so bitter. Sweet almonds, on the other hand, can only be eaten when they are ripe and not when they are small. So based on this, the Mishnah gives the following halacha. Hachayev b'shkedim hamarim poter b'masukim. What's mechuyev in meiser in the case of bitter almonds, the small unripe ones, is not mechuyev in them in the case of sweet almonds, because the small bitter almonds are edible, but small sweet almonds are not. Hachayev b'masukim poter b'morim. What is mechuyev in meiser in the case of the sweet almonds, which is the large ripe almonds, is not going to be mechayev in the case of the bitter ones, because the large ones, the ripe sweet almonds, are edible, but large bitter almonds are not. So it depends which ones they are. If they're big, if they're small, if they're sweet, if they're bitter. how it's going to work, and each one is going to be the reverse of the other. Mishnah Hey, Ezehu Garnan Lamaiser. What is the finished condition for these kinds of produce in regard to maisros? That is, when are they considered completely processed and therefore also for snacking, for achilas arai, before they have been gemaised? To this point, the Mishnah has listed the stages of development at which different kinds of produce first become subject to the halachas of maisros. However, even at that stage, a person is still mutter to eat from it achilas arai without taking off maiser. If it's only if you want to eat in a regular way, then you must separate maisros. The stage at which the produce becomes usher for achilas arai is when it has been picked and it's been completely processed and it's now ready to be removed from the field. The next few Mishnayos are going to discuss when various kinds of produce are considered to be completely processed. So, Ezu Garnan Lamaiser, when is the goren, the finished condition for these kinds of produce, considered finished for maisros? Hakishum badlumishi faksu, cucumbers and gourds are finished once he removes the hairy covering that surrounds them. When cucumbers and gourds are small, they're covered with a hairy substance. When they're completely ripe, the hairy covering falls off. Someone who picks them before they're usually ripe, will usually rub the covering off himself before selling them. Once he does so, the cucumbers and gourds are considered completely processed. But if he doesn't plan to remove the hairy covering, then they are finished once he makes them into a pile. A melon is finished once he removes the hairy covering that surrounds it. This is the same process that's described in the Mishnah just now about the pikus, if he doesn't plan to remove the hairy covering, the melon's not finished until he makes a muktzah for the melons. What's a muktzah? A muktzah is an area where all the melons are laid out after they are picked. They're not usually put in a pile because they're heavy and would damage each other. So instead, they're laid out, in one level, and until they're ready to be removed from the field. Yarek hanegad mishiyoigat. Vegetables that are usually tied in bundles. This is how they are sold. Are finished once he ties them in bundles. So if he doesn't plan to tie them in bundles, they're not finished until he fills a container which he collects them. If he doesn't plan to fill just that one container but intends to fill a few containers, they're not finished until he gathers all the vegetables he needs and puts them in containers. He may continue to snack from the vegetables in the first containers until the last one has been filled. Similarly, if he plans to collect less than a container worth of vegetables, they become usher for achilas arai once he gathers everything he plans to take. Kalkala ad sheyechape. If he puts the vegetables in a large basket instead of a small container, they're not finished until he covers them with leaves. A large basket has a wide opening, and the vegetables will get dried out by the sun if they're not covered. It was therefore common to cover the vegetables in the basket with leaves once the person was finished collecting them. If he doesn't plan to cover them, they can be eaten as a snack only until he fills the container. Doesn't plan to fill just that one container, but a few containers, they're not finished until he gathers all the vegetables he needs and puts them in containers. He may continue eating achilas arai from the first ones until the last ones have been filled. What case are we talking about? When do we say that it's usher to eat achilas arai from the peiros that had reached the goren lamaiser? But mailach lashuk. It's only when he's taking the produce from the field to sell in the market. However, if he's taking the produce to his house to use for himself, he may eat from it as a snack until he reaches the house. Minatayra produce may be eaten without maasros being separated until it's brought into the house. However, the Rabbanan were geyser that once produce has been completely processed, it becomes usher to be eaten achilas arai, and if certain additional things happen to it, so selling it would be one of these things. For this reason, achilas arai should become usher when the produce reaches the market and is ready for sale. However, since a farmer might meet a buyer on the way and sell him the produce before reaching the market, the Chachamim were geyser that produce meant for the market becomes forbidden to be eaten achilas arai as soon as it has been completely processed in the field and is ready to be brought to the market. Meaning that the Rabbanan were geyser that it's also to eat it at an earlier stage in the game. This is true only for produce that is intended for sale. Produce a farmer plans to take home and use is not subject to this concern since he plans to use it for himself and he will not sell it. Therefore, it doesn't become forbidden for snacking until it reaches his house. There are 6 things that cause finished produce to become usher to be eaten as a snack even before bringing it into the house. Number 1, bring it into the courtyard, even without bringing it into the house. Number 2, selling it. Number 3, cooking it. Number 4, salting it. Number 5, separating truma from it. And number 6, Shabbos, the arrival of Shabbos. All these 6 things are known as being kevel meiser, meaning that the produce must now have meiser separated from it before it can be eaten in any way at all. Reb Chaim Kanievsky and Darach Hamuna points out that in most cases, cooking and salting cause even unfinished produce to become asur for achilas aray as well. Okay, Mishnah Vav. HaPered v'atimukan v'charuvim mishayamid arema. Pered are dried pomegranate seeds. Interesting, I don't know that we have this lashon anywhere else. V'atimukim are raisins, dried grapes. V'charuvim, dried carobs. Mishayamid arema, once he makes a pile of them after they've been left out in the sun and dried. So that's considered when it's completely processed. Onions are finished once he peels off the rotten parts of the outer layers. If he doesn't plan to peel them before he removes them from the field, they're finished once he makes a pile of them. Grain is finished once he heaps it into a pile and smooths it down. If he doesn't plan to smooth down the pile, it can be eaten as a snack only until he heaps it into a pile. If he doesn't intend to smooth the pile, then making the pile shows that he's finished processing the grain. The kidneys, beans, are finished once he sifts them to take out the earth that sticks to them. They have a lot of... Kidneys is the name of a category of vegetables that includes all plants besides grain whose edible parts are seeds, beans and peas, and grain always refers to the chamesh minei dagan. Typically, legumes, beans, are uprooted from the ground, not cut. Therefore, there's usually some earth mixed together with the beans. The beans must therefore be sifted to remove the earth, and we know now, even with our beans that we buy in the store, many times it's processed, but you'll see sometimes in the package there's some clumps of earth in it as well. So you got to sift them out to take out the earth that clings to them. If he doesn't plan to sift them in the field, they can be eaten as a snack until he smooths down the pile. Even though he already smoothed down the pile, and most of the grain in the pile must have its meiser separated before it can be eaten, he may still take from the ears that are not completely threshed. Kutoim means that it's not, it was cut off some way. From the grain on the sides of the pile that was not smoothed down, and from the grain that's still mixed with the straw because not been properly winnowed, and he may eat all of those grains as a snack without separating meisers. Since these grains have not reached the end of their processing, they may still be eaten as a snack. Even though the main body of the pile has been smoothed, the grain that has not been fully processed may still be eaten as a snack. Mishnah Zayin, Hayayin Mishei Kafe. The Mishnah teaches when wine and oil are considered completely processed. In the times of the Mishnayos, wine was made by placing grapes on a slanted surface, known as the upper wine press, and stepping on them to squeeze out the juice. The juice then flows down the slanted surface through a pipe into a cistern, where it would sit to ferment. As it fermented, grape seeds and pieces of peels that flowed into the cistern along with the juice would gradually rise to the top and would be removed. The juice was then poured into barrels where it would spend more time fermenting. The first part of the Mishnah teaches when wine is considered finished that it can no longer be drunk even as a snack without taking off meiser. Wine is considered completely processed once he skims it to remove the seeds and peels that rise to the top while it ferments in the cistern. Even after he skimmed the wine in the cistern, he may still collect wine from the upper wine press and from the pipe leading from the upper wine press to the bottom cistern, and drink that wine as a snack without separating meisers. Since that wine has not yet reached the cistern and was not yet skimmed, we may still drink it as a snack. The Mishnah now teaches halacha of oil. Hashemen misheyered leuka. Oil is considered processed once it goes down into the trough. In the times of the Mishnayos, oil was made by crushing olives to pulp with a mortar or a millstone. The olive pulp was then placed in a rough sack, typically made of ropes woven together. A heavy beam would be lowered onto the sack to squeeze the oil out of the pulp, and the oil would flow through the sack into a trough where it was collected. The Mishnah teaches when oil is considered finished that it can no longer be eaten achilas aray without separating meisers. So shemen misheyered leuka, oil is considered completely processed once it goes down into the trough. Aval pisha yorad, even after it went down into the trough, neitel min ha'ekel, he may still take oil from the sack which has not yet flowed into the trough, and mibein hamemel, and oil from under the millstone that stuck to it when he first crushed the olives, and mibein hapatzim, and oil from between the boards of the oil press that never flowed into the trough. And he could put that oil into a hot wafer. It was a thin wafer that was commonly smeared with oil when it was fresh out of the oven and was still hot. or into hot food in a serving dish, and eat it without taking off Meiser first. Since this oil never went down into the trough, he may still eat it achilas arai. However, he may not put this oil into a pot or a frying pan of food that has just been removed from the fire, as long as they're still hot, because the oil comes cooked in them, and the cooked food can never be eaten without separating Meiser, even as a snack. Cooking produce is one of the things that is kevel meiser, and prohibits even snacking from it before you take off Meiser. This is true even if the produce was not finished. This is what we mentioned before from Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky, that sometimes you can bump into one of the things that are kevel meiser before another one. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, and he says that kol unesein, you may put the oil that has not gone down into the trough into anything, even into food, in a hot pot or frying pan that is no longer on the fire, except for something that contains vinegar or brine. Vinegar and brine cause food placed in them to cook more easily. Therefore, oil from which Meiser has not yet been separated cannot be added to a hot pot of food that contains vinegar and brine. According to Rabbi Yehuda, a hot pot cannot cook anything once it's off the fire unless it has vinegar or brine in it. Mishnah Ches. Ha'igol meshiach kenu. A round cake of dried figs is finished once he glazes its surface by rubbing fruit juice on it. This was done to make it look shiny. Since this is the final step in preparing the igulei dvela, the dvela figs that are being dried and pressed into a cake are not considered finished until the cake has been rubbed with fruit juice. We may glaze a fig cake by rubbing it with figs and grapes that are tevel, so that the juice is squeezed out onto the fig cake, the igulei dvela. Since the juice goes directly into the fig cake and is either absorbed by it or runs off, it's not considered juice, and is therefore not forbidden as tevel. Rabbi Yehuda, however, Rabbi Yehuda forbids it. In his opinion, the juice is considered tevel and may not be eaten without Meiser being taken off. There's another machlekes here in the Mishnah about tuma and the zayin mashkim and grapes. Hamachlik ba'anovim lehuchshar. If someone glazes a fig cake by rubbing it with grapes, thereby wetting it with grape juice, it doesn't become susceptible to tuma, since the juice was squeezed from the grape only to coat the figs, not to be used as a liquid. It's not considered a liquid in regard to making the food Mukhshal l'kabel tuma. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Hochsha. Rabbi Yehuda says the fig is Mukhshal l'kabel tuma because grape juice is considered liquid in regard to these halachas, which is interesting. In the last parak in Trumas we discussed different fruit juices don't have, are not going to be Mukhshal l'kabel tuma. Hagregris misha yodosh, dried figs that are not made into a cake are considered finished once he squashes them into a barrel. Mugura misha agel, and if he doesn't put them into a barrel, he puts them into a storage room instead. They are finished once he smooths out the pile. If he is pressing the figs into a barrel or smoothing out the pile in the storage room, and he wasn't finished yet, and the barrel broke or the storehouse broke open, so it can't be used anymore, he may not eat from them as a snack without separating Meiser from them, even though he didn't finish in Gansen, but those that he had packed in were completely processed and cannot be eaten without Meiser taken. Rabbi Yossi, however, permits eating them as a snack because he holds that no figs are completely processed until all the figs have been packed into the barrel or smoothed down into the pile. Ad kan.